Well, hello there, guys. Welcome back to New DM. This is Ariel's New DM channel. It's D&D Saturday. Just got through playing my weekly D&D, DMing my weekly session at the library, and I thought I would take a crack at continuing our ongoing series on death and D&D. And death, as I mentioned several weeks ago, whenever it was that I dropped the last video, we that has been a very prominent discussion uh, regarding death of characters in fifth edition, primarily after a couple of characters came near death in the Critical Role stream by Matt Mercer, popular fifth edition D&D stream show Critical Role, and so that gave me the idea of exploring how death has been looked upon within the various iterations or various editions or various forms of Dungeons and Dragons, all the way back to uh, basic. And so that's we're continuing that series today. This is part two, and I thought rather than sit down and go through the me reading some of the uh, source books or from the player's handbook, we I start off taking a look at this article about death in Dungeons and Dragons, and then if there's some time, then I we can go over some of the way the death mechanics were handled in previous editions, as opposed to like fifth. This one specifically talks about death in fifth edition, and then the title or the headline caught my eye. So let's take a look at and see what this author has to say about D&D in death, character deaths in D&D, fifth edition. Okay, guys, so here we are, and we're looking at character death in D&D. This comes from the halflinghobbies.com website, Halfling Hobbies, which is a YouTuber from a YouTube personality that talks about Dungeons and Dragons. I don't know her name. I looked up the you can look at the website and find out by yourself, but she doesn't have her byline on this. But basically, the article says it's the right way to handle PC death in Dungeons and Dragons 5e. So if you have, she start off by saying, if you have played D&D for long, you most likely lost a character. A moment of silence, please. This is difficult as a player, but it's especially difficult as a DM. How are you, as a DM, supposed to lead your group through the loss of player characters? And she has some do's and don'ts. So it says, do let the players have his or her last words if possible. Have a funeral or celebration of life of the characters in game. Oh wow, this is pretty interesting. I will honestly say I have never had a funeral for a or celebration of life for a polling character. I do remember playing through the tutorial of the old basic, the 1983 basic set, and that was pretty brutal opening adventure. So one of the characters died, and they just checking for gold, took all these artifacts, and moved on. Allow the fallen character to write a letter or journal entry after the fact that the other players can find on his or her body. Let the players have his or her last word if possible. Let the player have that. Have a funeral celebration of life of the character in game. It's a little iffy, but I don't get this. Allow the fallen character to write a letter or journal entry after the fact that the other players can find his or her body. So maybe the character was anticipating death, and he wrote like a letter. Um, kind of reminds me of like Back to the Future, where um, not to spoil a 20, 30-year-old movie or however long it's been, but you know how Marty McFly writes a letter to the professor, and the professor doesn't want to read it because it's gonna spoil the future for him. That's kind of what it reminds me for some reason. So does this character, was he ill? Was he going into a perilous situation? Did he know he was gonna die? And so wrote like sort of like a letter to say his goodbye just in case. It's kind of weird. I mean, like, doesn't the party have a cleric? One of the things about fifth edition that I talked about in part one of this video series was that there's a lot of ways to revive a character, so death is never really, I mean, it's rarely permanent, although it does happen. Celebrate the character outside of the game. Okay, that can easily be done, and keep the memory alive. That makes sense. Don't punish the player for dying. No, I mean, dying is part of life, in game or out game, so why would you get punished for it? Brush over his or her death. This one's a little iffy. I mean, I have seen people brush over somebody's death. Um, I've seen some people get angry over the fact that a character went down to 0 hit points and had to be revived, um, more than once. Bring in a new PC immediately, a new player character immediately. Okay, blame the player. So don't do that. Don't bring in a new PC immediately. Okay, that makes sense. Don't blame the player even if it was their fault, and don't be afraid of PC death. Okay, that sounds like sound advice. And then the videos are gonna be interesting. I would react to the videos, but my processor has been kind of faulty in the past. I don't know if it's OBS recording software or it is my processor, but they don't really play back that well on this recording. So let's just read what she has to say. Should players ever die? That is the question. That is what we're here to find out. The first question you need to ask yourself is this, and my answer to that, even before reading, is yeah, they should. The first question you need to ask yourself is this: do I want death to be a real possibility in my campaign? Yes, I do. She goes on to say that most DMs never consider the fact that they are, in fact, in charge of the world and have the option to exclude deaths from it. If the purpose of your campaign is character development and your group is extremely attached to all the players and their stories, then you can exclude the deaths from your game and focus on the aspects you and your party enjoy. You are allowed to do this, she says in bold. Does this mean your role has no consequence and lacks challenging elements? Of course not. If you choose to exclude the death element from your game, there are other ways to make encounters challenging and tense. Try using some of these non-lethal methods. Why would you eliminate death? Death is part of you're adventurers, you're going out, you're fighting dragons, you're fighting monsters, you're doing all kinds of extraordinary things. I don't understand why the modern concept of game design, where a lot of people are hung up on the fact that the characters should be superheroes, should be all powerful, should be omnipotent, should not die, should not even face the threat of death. But let's see what she has to say further on. Creating challenges without death, permanent scars. There's a nice photo there of permanent scars when a player would normally die in combat, either from negative points or failed death saves. Instead, give that player now permanent scar which they must deal with for the rest of the campaign. This can be a small scar down the face, small as a scar down the face, to mental damage. You see the insanity chart? Yeah, you can make him insane. Yeah, to losing a limb or eye. These scars can add to the character's development, make the game more challenging, but keep players alive without the fear of death. See, I think the problem or the issue at hand is that it sounds from like her perspective, or which is a lot of people's perspective, is that in order to have character development, if you have death and you automatically kill the character, then you can't develop any further. To which I say, hogwash. That's a bunch of hogwash. I mean, your character doesn't have to even inhabit a corporeal being. I mean, they could, if they fought a vampire, they could get turned into a vampire. Granted, they're not necessarily going to be the same person because now they're going to be a vampire. But it's up to the DM. The vampire could say, "Oh, he's still the same person, and he retains he doesn't necessarily turn into a monster, undying monster per se. Maybe he has to go out. Definitely needs to go out, stay away from sunlight, and get some change his or her diet to include only liquids and blood. But there's some nuance there where they don't rigidly have to follow the trope, you know. So that's just one example I can think of. But anyway, out of action. Out of action. Little Teddy Bear is out of action. He's on IR, as they say in the sports world. Another option is to require the party to recuperate after any encounter in which a party member is knocked unconscious. going down to 0 hit points. The time required would vary based on how many were injured and the extent of the injuries. Okay, what if you're in the middle of a fight with a boss monster, a dragon, I don't know, some kind of orc creature, and he's pounding on the party? Is it realistic? Time out, Mr. Orc. You know, we have fallen right here. We need to go back to camp, and we're gonna need to take a time out. He needs to recover. I know that you want to kill us, and I know that you don't like adventurers, but let's be fair. I know, yeah, you have a chaotic evil alignment, but that doesn't matter. Um, God, how could that even happen? I mean, we're suspending, yes, we can suspend. Suspension of disbelief is a thing. We're fighting creatures that don't exist. But within the fantasy world and the fantasy realm, we also have to have some kind of logic. Is it logical or does it make any sense that in the middle of a battle, somebody goes down to 0 hit points, becomes unstable? You know, sometimes the casters, the clerics, or the spellcasters don't even have time to cast spells because they gotta maintain concentration, so they can't. That's the whole reason they're not up front battling with the fighter or the barbarians or the melee. They're in the back casting spells from range because they're squishy, you know. And if they lose concentration, then their spells fizzle, you know. Um, so this doesn't make any sense. For example, if the wizard would have been killed in the fight, I would explain that the damage they receive makes it impossible for them to physically withstand the casting of spells of 3 level or higher until they are fully recuperated about 1 week. That's already part of the game. That's already part of the mechanics. You know, if he loses concentration, then he can't cast spells. This can apply to all classes in different ways. A torn rotator cuff prevents the barbarian from swinging his great sword. Ah, I don't know if this is supposed to be comedy or we're supposed to take this seriously. Are you kidding me? Our torn rotator cuff makes it impossible. The barbarian's not gonna care about a torn rotator. He's a barbarian. He's raging. He's a hulking monster class or player class is a raging hulking class. You know, he's gonna if he has a torn rotator cuff, you know, he's gonna keep fighting. Alekas makes the rogue roll with disadvantage on stealth checks. Well, yeah, I mean, if you have Alekas, you're gonna have disadvantage on stealth check, um, or you're gonna be out of being stealthy anyway. So, a concussion prevents the cleric from using divine magic. A concussion prevents any caster, the cleric or otherwise, from using any type of magic because he cannot move his arms. There's a somatic component. He cannot do incantations and all that stuff, and he cannot concentrate. This way of playing makes fights more challenging, as a simple cure wounds and keep going isn't going to cut it. Well, no, it's not going to cut it. People will be heavily damaged, and some people could die during a battle. All encounters will carry consequences, but especially those in which players could have been killed. They carry consequences no matter what, whether it's life or death situation. I would argue that it's even more. It carries more if there's a threat of death. It doesn't imply tension when to use death in your campaign. Always. If you still want to use death as a real and present threat in your campaign, yes, I do. Then it needs to be real and present. It's always real and present. Whether you choose to use death or not is not the issue. It sounds like it's part of the issue because we want to go ahead and mitigate this situation. It is whether or not you are consistent with whatever you decide to do. Okay, that makes sense. If players can die in your campaign, then they need to know that this is the case. I thought they know that going in the isn't that logical sense? Hello, we're a band of adventurers, but we're going into this dungeon. We don't know what's in there, and all of a sudden, even before we see the undead skeletons, we heard rumors that there were some unusual paranormal activity here. The commoners and the townfolk told us to go in there because they're afraid to, and we're trying to retrieve the princess or whatever the goal is. But they can't do it because they don't have our abilities or our experience. But we know that it's dangerous. Who goes into any situation saying that death could not, that it could be not risky or you cannot die? I think that's inherent in the narrative, but what do I know? Um, but it does mean that if a player would die according to the rule, then that player should die. No exception. Not even for your favorite PCs. Yeah, yeah. When should PCs die? The player's handbook states that a player dies when they take damage in one hit equal to 2 times their total max HP, or when players fail three death saves after falling unconscious. Okay, yeah, 3 death saves is a lot, but you get them in 5e. Players can also be instant killed by spells such as power word kill or events such as a rock slide or falling building. Okay, we're getting to the meat and bones of this piece, I think. Do's and do nots of player deaths. If this is the way you are running your campaign, then players are sure to die at some point. When this happens, it is important that you, the DM, handle this correctly. A poorly handled death can lead to feelings of frustration, anger, and even players leaving your game. Oh no, we're gonna hurt the PC's fifis. We don't want to hurt the PC's fifis. You know, they can go play Little Rainbow Unicorn because obviously they don't have the stomach for getting torn to pieces by an orc or by a rampaging Uberhawk or by a, God forbid, they go up against a dragon or like an older dragon. To avoid this and make the experience one that brings the group together instead of tearing them apart, you should start by following simple list of do's and don'ts. And they elaborate on these. Let the players have his or her last words if possible. If at all possible, in the circumstance, let the player have a few last words for the other players to remember him, her by. But if you don't have time, you're in the middle of a battle and you're losing the battle, unless you are winning and you're playing with morale rules and you have the monsters have run away because they lost their leader, you're not going to have a lot of time to say a few words. In some instances, it might be appropriate for a final conversation if the player is dying of a disease or spell effect the other players cannot stop. How is this going to happen in 5th edition when you have clerics running around, when you have revivify spells? There's all kinds of ways. Look, this is not AD&D where if you go up against a vampire and he level drains you, you're going to start losing levels as well as hit points. This is 5th edition where it's almost impossible to die to begin with. Last words give a sense of finality to the scene. They also allow the player to say that they have been meaning to say but never did. This sounds more like advice of if you have a streaming show like Critical Role, where the audience gets invested in the characters and somebody falls and it's tragic and devastating, and so they want these people to say goodbye to them. But it's not really realistic in any D&D games that I played or DM. Allow the character to write a letter or journal entry after they have been killed for others to find. This is the Back to the Future sort of reference. Dear party, it has been such a great time defending realms with you, going out and killing monsters, going on missions, getting that sweet loot. But alas, I think that I will not are not going to be here. Like who writes this type of stuff, right? I mean, if you have an experienced fighter, he's not gonna sit down and get in touch with his feelings so that the party will remember him. No, he's gonna go out. He knows this might be his last campaign for what or adventure for whatever reason. He's gonna go down and he's gonna chop off somebody's head and he's gonna hang it on his mantelpiece and say, "You wanna remember me by? Look at that! Look at that trophy and have a drink on me." That's what he's gonna do. He's not gonna write a damn letter in his journal. I don't know if I can get through this, guys. I don't know if I can get through it, but we'll soldier on. Have a funeral or celebration of life. Okay? Celebrate the character outside of the game. Wait, the player characters, we celebrate anyway. If we have a good game, we celebrate anyway. But yeah. Oh, Zor, the barbarian. He left us way too early. He was such a good member of the party. How we're gonna replace him? My cousin Jimmy's coming in next week, and he's gonna roll up another one. But you know, we're gonna miss Thor. We're gonna miss him for sure. Mostly because he could rage, and we could use him as a meat shield. But let's leave that part out of the celebration of life. Keep the memory alive. Again, look at that head hanging on the mantelpiece and think of me. Punish a don't do not. These are the do nots. Okay, do not punish a player for dying. No, I mean if they do something stupid, if they pull a Leroy Jenkins, then you might kind of. I like I said, I've seen other players be annoyed by the fact that they've had to uh, revive a character that went down to 0 hit points because he was doing stupid things. But um, you know, it happens. Do not brush over the player's death. The absolute worst thing you can do as a DM is to brush over a character's death. But most of all, most all of us rather, most all of us have seen the DM have seen it done. DM says the rest of the party sees Warren lying on the ground, covered in blood, dead, knowing there's nothing you can do. You all can continue on down the hall and wait. This leaves the player feeling like the character didn't matter and not knowing quite what to do. Um, it's debatable, right? I mean, he's dead. There's not much that he can do. The cleric didn't revive him for some reason, or the spellcaster didn't cast a revivify spell. Do not hand them a PHB and tell them go roll a new character real quick. I don't know. I think it works both ways. I distinctly remember being a player and being excited about joining my neighborhood uh, group. I heard a group was playing on the weekends, and I went one time in my hometown, and the DM was a real hard ass. So I remember it was around the time that Curse of Strahd was really popular, and I was kind of hesitant to play it at first because everybody was playing it. It was too popular, and I was like, okay, I'll give it a shot. But I know that there were higher level monsters and challenges there, and I don't know remember how it happened, but the character died. He didn't make his save throw, and I sat there watching everybody play. The DM didn't say anything. He didn't say, "Oh, well, you can come back next week," or just hang around and we'll have you re-roll. Here's a character. None of that happened. They just kept playing, and I was annoyed. I was like, okay, this is kind of rude, but not because I died per se, but because I had just come in, and it's almost like the DM was like, okay, you gotta learn with death. It's part of the game, but I didn't really give you a fair shot at staying alive because my objective is to kill characters. So I see that there should be a balance, is what I'm saying, but it doesn't always happen. Bring in a new piece. Do not bring in a new player character immediately. Do not bring in a new player character immediately. You gotta wait a bit. After a PC death, you will likely want to get the player back into the action as soon as possible. But immediately throwing a new PC into the party after a loss is always a bad idea. I don't know. Might not be always a bad idea. I think it depends on the context. But let's see what she says. First of all, the player who lost their character needs time to create and become familiar with a new one. That's true, especially at higher levels. This can be very difficult. Whereas they had lots of time to gradually understand the class mechanics while leveling up in the previous character, they now have to try and understand all the mechanics at once with a new build. Who says they have to learn it at once? I played higher level characters and I learned as I go. You can always learn as you go. You may not be min max. You may not have a min max character. You may not be able to do everything or play as an expert, but it takes a while to get acclimated to the different classes. Just like it takes a while. Let's think of it this way: if you had a job and somebody quit, and then they trained in a new person to take over, are they gonna know what all their job duties are? No, they're gonna have to learn as they go. There's only so much coaching you can train. I think this is kind of the same thing, in my opinion. Players should be allowed to take as much time as they need to come up with a complete character and understand their new. No, I don't agree with that. The next problem with immediately inserting a new character is that it always feels forced. It doesn't have to feel forced. There's ways you can do it, and I think that um, if you have imagination, you can do it. I much prefer to have the player there enjoying the story, but wait for a natural feeling moment to introduce them to the party. I see what you're saying. Don't kind of force somebody in and wait for the right time to introduce them. Yeah, it may take a few sessions, but it's always worth it for a natural feel it creates. Yeah, that can happen. I kind of agree with that. I also find that the other players are excited to find out where the new character is, so they are much likely to pick up on hooks and talk to strangers. Just make sure all your players know what's going on. We just had this happen every time a new, it doesn't have to be somebody that just lost a character through death mechanics. It happens every time a new person comes into an ongoing existing campaign, and there's always a way to creatively bring them in or not. It could be cliche. I mean, just today we had a couple of new players, and they were at the inn, and they had just rested from an ongoing campaign. And what did we do? One of them was brand new, and I said, okay. He interacted with the other character. He waited at a corner, and then the rest of the players were playing darts. And he gingerly came over, introduced himself, asked if he could play, and then got to know the party. So there are ways to bring in a character, whether they are brand new or their other character has died and they're replacing it, whatever the thing is. But you don't have to wait a long time, is what I'm saying. Don't play the blame game. Okay, yeah. Player deaths are difficult and all players react differently. One way your players might react to blame you or others for their deaths. This is understandable. They are upset and looking for someone to blame. However, you must resist the temptation to blame the player for their death, even if it is clearly their own fault. Yeah, you stupid fool. We told you that there were werewolves running around, and you didn't check behind the door. You just went in the middle of the night without actually looking for help, without doing any investigation. You just willy nilly went in there, and you got bit, and now you're a damn werewolf. And now you're complaining that you can't play the game because we have to lock you in a cell because there's going to be full moons for the next 3 nights, and we don't want to deal with you as a liability to the party. Hey, this happened in one of the games I played. He didn't die, but he did something stupid, and then he was complaining about doing something that he may have been warned about in advance, but he did it anyway. There's a little blame that is warranted there, I think. And don't be afraid of PC death. I think that's the last point. Finally, do not be afraid of PC death. That is what I'm not even going to read that because that's what I've been saying from the very beginning since we started this whole series. I think it was ridiculous. My opinion that Critical Role fans, I get it. They're attached to the characters and they're blaming the DM for nearly getting a couple of them uh, dying and calling him all kinds of names and threatening or whatever. He responded on Twitter saying that he understands and people need a chance. People have to have a chance to process. That's the term. They gotta process because their fifis are hurt and their characters might die. Oh, a character might die in a fantasy game where death is a possibility. Okay, that's it for now. Thank you for tuning in to this discussion. A little bit of a rant, but I do feel that there is a way to handle character death in D&D and 5e, and I don't necessarily are on the same page as this author's conclusions or recommendations. But be that as it may, we will uh, continue the discussion in the death in D&D series. I think we're going to go back to mechanics and take a look at how death was handled in the second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons versus the newer edition of the game.